Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Resuming Debate. Foreign interference is the talk of the town in Ottawa. This has been a long-running story, in particular involving the interference of Beijing's Communist Party in Canada, efforts to interfere in elections, achieve outcomes at the local and perhaps even national level that reflected the evaluation of their interests by a foreign authoritarian communist political party. The latest revelations on this story have involved Conservative MP and Foreign Affairs Shadow Minister Michael Chong. Michael Chong moved the motion in the last Parliament to recognize the Uyghur genocide. And this was, I think, a seminal moment in the global discussion around Uyghurs. Canada was the first legislature to recognize the Uyghur genocide. So, of course, this was an important moment for the rights of Uyghurs, a very positive moment from my perspective, but no doubt it was a moment that was taken note of by the Communist Party, and it seems that Michael Chong became a target for them after that. We've learned in the last week that Michael's family was directly targeted. In fact, he has family in Hong Kong, that the government was aware of this but did not inform him of this when they first became aware. So major concern about the lack of response from the government, the lack of information that was shared, and the fact that the Chinese diplomat in Canada involved in this has not yet been expelled. We will, I think, at some point have my friend and colleague Michael Chong on the podcast, but part of the mandate of the Resuming Debate podcast, for those who listen regularly will know, part of our mandate is to try to have cross-party conversations about important issues as well. And so I'm very pleased that we have another MP who has been vocal on these issues from a different partisan background to join us for a conversation about the issues around foreign interference, as well as his own personal experiences with that. So very pleased that we have MP Kevin Vuong joining us. He currently sits as an independent. He ran as a Liberal MP in the riding of Spadina Fort York, and he's been very outspoken on foreign interference, using his seat as an independent MP to carve out and speak on behalf of the priorities that are most important to him and that he's hearing from people in his community. So, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Garnet, thank you very much for having me.
Kevin, let's start a little bit with your family background. We were chatting before we came on. You're of ethnic Chinese origin, but your family's from Southeast Asia. My impression, certainly, of this foreign interference issue is that MPs of Chinese origin have been, especially if they've been critical of the Chinese government, been targeted in a particular way. So maybe you could share a bit about just who you are from a personal family background perspective.
Sure. So my parents were part of the Chinese diaspora that was in Vietnam. They grew up what at the time was, a emerging democracy in South Vietnam. Obviously, that all came crashing down when, after a number of horrific attacks and tragedies, including the breaking of a truce for the Lunar New Year by the Viet Cong, they escaped like so many people as part of that generation of boat people. And my parents actually met in the refugee camp in Thailand, where they spent 2 years before they were lucky enough to be welcomed and sponsored to Canada. And so I grew up, fortunately, here in Canada, knowing that I was ethnically Chinese. We spoke Cantonese at home, put me in school, Chinese school, to learn Mandarin, not that I retained much of it, but also spoke Vietnamese as well, because we are culturally Vietnamese and Chinese, being the ethnic background. And so those were some of the stories that I kind of grew up with, right? That my parents really wanted to ingrain in me, because they risked their lives to be able to come to a country that embraced human rights, embraced democracy. Those were values that were important to them. And those are the sort of values that they wanted my brother and I to grow up in. And so I think I know better than most young people just how precious these things are and how important it is that we stand up for them and we fight against those who would seek to interfere in our country and tear those down.
Mm-hmm. That's a great story, and one of those seminal moments in the growth of Canadian culture of welcoming refugees was the response supporting refugees from Vietnam. And would you agree that there's sort of like in Canada there's a group of kind of anti-communist refugees, people from Eastern Europe, people from various parts of East Asia, who have this familial memory of communist systems, and that motivates in some ways like the large and active Cuban community in the United States, that motivates this commitment to a freedom-oriented foreign policy.
Absolutely. And it starts at home, and it starts with civic engagement, right? And so that's why often I found that there were a number of really engaged young people. I was proud to serve on the board of both the Chinese Canadian National Council in Toronto, as well as the Vietnamese Association of Toronto. Two organizations that are where we, the people who come from these different communities who believe so much in democracy and practicing it and defending it, kind of found ourselves and channeled that commitment to be able to ultimately serve our broader community, right? And those are things that I think ultimately are red flags for the Chinese Communist Party, right? They've even, as it relates to the Chinese Canadian National Council, they've come up with their own kind of competing umbrella federal organization to try to drown out an organization that they believe is too democratically inclined, people who would not be sympathetic to their agenda.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting dynamic that you've just described, right? Where you have people who come to this country with an understanding of what communism is and a strong rejection of that, but those people and their voice is a particular threat to those foreign governments. That's maybe part of the genesis of foreign interference to try to limit that pro-freedom voice that comes naturally from some of these diaspora communities.
Absolutely. I think we see that. And frankly, that's, I think, part of what has led me and others to suspect that the sequence of events that occurred to me in terms of this magical allegation coming out 4 days before the general election in an effort to try to not get me elected, but failing that, to still besmirch my name, dragged my reputation and character through the mud, so that when I do rise in the House, and I'll tell you, it was a hard slog in the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. Where they could just easily try to dismiss anything I had to say because of what they had tried to do to my name and my reputation.
Mm-hmm. So I want to delve more into that part of your story, but just before we get to that, kind of developing this issue of foreign interference, the allegations we heard in the last week about MP Michael Chong, you had some comments about those specifically, and I know many MPs have spoken passionately about it, but in particular, people that have experienced these kinds of threats themselves. What was your reaction to Michael Chong's situation?
It's horrific. I couldn't begin to imagine what it felt like to know that your family was being targeted by a foreign power. And then later to find out that this information existed, that it was identified by our intelligence service. And for some reason, no one in the government thought it would be worthwhile to let a member of the House of Commons of Canada know that their family was being targeted. I don't understand it, and this government needs to explain what happened.
Mm-hmm. You're not a member of the Liberal caucus now. You're an independent MP, but you got elected initially, or you ran initially as a candidate with the Liberal Party. You've been very critical of the current government on foreign interference. If you could be share a bit of your journey on the partisan side. I mean, what led to your engagement initially with the Liberal Party? Obviously, as someone who's passionate about freedom and democracy around the world, I know a lot of conservatives would say that the Conservative Party is much stronger on issues of championing freedom and democracy and challenging the idea of communism. You must clearly have been satisfied to some extent that there was enough alignment on those issues between you and the Liberal Party, at least at the time. What was your thinking then? What's your thinking now about the performance of the government?
Yeah, I mean, I was up until 2021, for the most part, fiercely nonpartisan and proudly so, because I think, sometimes, when you put your partisan blinders up, sometimes, people have a tendency to be too focused on the wrong things. Whereas as just a professional, I always like to look at the facts and focus on the action that can be taken. And I think actions always speak louder than words. So when the opportunity came, when I was asked to run as the Liberal candidate in Spadina Fort York, I guess naively at the time thought, hey, this is a great opportunity for me to be able to bring my experience as an entrepreneur, as someone who has built and operated small businesses, as well as proudly serving in the Naval Reserves. I will have been in the Navy now for 8 years, and I felt like those were experiences and perspectives that were going unheard among the Liberal caucus. And so naively, I thought, hey, you know what? I haven't really ever been a card-carrying member of the federal Liberals, but you know what? If this is my chance to be able to serve my country, to be able to honor the incredible act by Canadians in welcoming my parents as refugees, that was a way to do it out of uniform as well, where it could be my day job, right? In addition to being able to serve in the Navy. Obviously, that did not come to be. And frankly, I think sitting here right now speaking with you, I think I can confidently say that I'm a better parliamentarian for it, because while it was a steep learning curve and it was a really hard start, I now know a lot more in terms of the abilities and mechanisms that exist for members of parliament to be able to champion the issues that are important to our constituents. Obviously, I have the ability to raise issues without having to worry about a whip telling me, no, I can't say that. No, now's not the right time. No, can't, not those people. And so that's why this matter of foreign interference is something that I've spoken about extensively, because Spadina Fort York is not only home to Toronto's Chinatown, it's also where 1 in 7 of my constituents, like me, are of Chinese heritage.
Mm-hmm. Just kind of following up those comments about running for politics and thinking you can contribute. My impression is like one of the big challenges in our system is defining the role of the MP, and in particular, are we part of the decision-making structure of our government, or are we the sort of spokespeople, the ambassadors of the positions taken by the government? And I think it's a big problem if MPs come to perceive their roles as mere spokespeople for government positions. And yet the complaint that we've heard from multiple people, that in some cases past cabinet ministers, right, that's sort of implicitly even in Bill Morneau's critique of the government, he was someone who came in hoping to share aspects of his previous experience, and he felt that he was expected to be kind of a spokesperson for decisions that were made somewhere else. It's interesting as well, I guess, how that dynamic seems to have happened within the government caucus, and then also just how people continue nonetheless to be recruited on the basis that they will be heard, when in many cases afterwards they say they weren't heard, they were just expected to deliver the lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a frame of reference. I've only ever been sat as an independent, but it's the way it was kind of sold to me. It's like, well, we are asking you to run, Kevin, because based on your merits, based on your track record of success and engagement in the community and in the military and as an entrepreneur, that's the type of experience we want. So I was led to believe that this was a meritocracy, and our contributions would be welcomed. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I'm not able to, I don't sit on the government bench, so I don't know what it looks like from within caucus, but I have trouble believing that there are individuals who, many, across all of the House, bring such diverse experience and great depth of expertise. But I don't feel like right now in the government benches that expertise is respected, nor is it welcomed.
Mm-hmm. Because I think there would be a group of people within government caucus that would feel the way you do about foreign interference. There are some who it has come out, right, in votes or in statements they've made. And like on issues like a foreign interference registry or foreign agents registry, there's clearly significant diversity within the government caucus. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of the decisions they make. I feel though, we're having a good conversation, but maybe we're kind of burying the lead because people may not know actually the story of how you went from being a Liberal candidate to being an independent, and that's obviously a very important part of your story, and it relates to some of the themes we're going to talk about. So why don't you share, for those who remember the stories or for those who don't, what was the process through which you went from being a Liberal candidate to being an independent candidate and then an independent MP?
Sure. So, I mean, like I said earlier, I was asked to run and I accepted and I was campaigning. Things were going swimmingly. We were on track to do very well up and until 4 days before the election. Just magically, an allegation surfaced from a woman who had accused me of sexual assault. This happened back in 2019. What she did not note was the charge was thrown out by the female prosecutor at the time stated, and I quote, "It would not be in the public interest to pursue," end quote, right? So she recommended it at the height of the Me Too movement, I might add, to a female judge that the charge be withdrawn. There was no proof, there was no evidence. I trusted the system to do its thing. And when a charge is withdrawn, it doesn't exist anymore. We're innocent until proven guilty in this country. And I was found to be innocent, and I moved on with my life. It was a really hard time during that period, but we moved on. Then fast forward for 2 years, just absolute radio silence, right? Because listen, if at any point she felt like justice was not served, she could have pursued it. And this was during that intermittent period. I was on the radio regularly. I was on News Talk 1010. I was on the TV speaking about different things I was doing in the community, as well as on behalf of the Navy. And still nothing. And then until 4 days before the election, when she was allegedly away on a vacation for over a month. I don't know that there are many Canadians who can afford to take over a month off. But hey, that's apparently what she was doing. And the first thing she did when she came back was she ran to the Toronto Star and made this bogus allegation, resurface it again. Now listen, I know that politics can be dirty sometimes, frankly. That's why my mom, my late mother, didn't want me to run. But, if you take a critical political lens and review it, we know the Liberals wouldn't have done it because they wouldn't have shot themselves in the foot. The Conservatives, you guys aren't competitive in the riding, so you wouldn't even bother. Okay, and the NDP, frankly, know better. Know that they would need a week, really 2 weeks, to have my name removed from the ballot. So who would not know the nuances of Elections Canada and our democratic system? Maybe a country that doesn't operate in a democracy.
Mm-hmm. So basically the issue was you had faced a charge. The charge had been withdrawn, and then that charge resurfaced in a very public way in the immediate lead up to the election. And look, for the record, I think this is an interesting conversation. I haven't evaluated all the facts myself to say, I guess one logical explanation for what happened is that this was an individual who felt like who felt like in her mind she hadn't received justice, and that she kind of hadn't noticed, and then noticed that you were running and decided that that either in pursuit of justice or in the public interest that she needed to make it known. It's not necessarily the case that she was prompted by anyone or collaborating by anyone in doing this. It may have been just something that she did on her own. But your contention is that you think that this suggests the possibility, and there was a story in the National Post to this effect this past week as well, that the individual who brought this forward may have been prompted in some way. So what leads you to that conclusion, as opposed to just thinking this was someone who hadn't got, from their perspective, hadn't gotten justice and therefore was looking for other ways of getting it?
I mean, Garnet, it fits the Chinese MO of a honey trap, right? It's well documented that they've done this around the world, including in the US against a congressman, right? And if you look at the timeline, there are very seriously questionable things. So even before this 2-year radio silence of where she could have pursued justice if she felt it wasn't there, it's also the fact that I met the individual in just a few weeks after I had run, albeit unsuccessfully, municipally in 2018. And this was a very contentious race because the former MPP for my riding, who is now the member for Don Valley North, had also run against me as well too. So there's no love lost between him and I. And
which MP is that?
Mr. Han Dong.
Okay, all right.
I mean, it's common knowledge that he was MPP
right.
for my riding.
Okay, so you and Han Dong had run against each other for things before. He has been the center of some allegations around foreign interference, and he is outside of the government caucus now as a result of those allegations. You and him have then run against each other, and I guess had some different perspectives around Canada-China relations. Fair to say.
I at the time we didn't really get into it because it was a municipal council race, right? So the focus was really on who best could be able to serve what we call wards in Toronto. And so there's no love lost between the both of us. Ultimately, when the premier cut city council in half, he did not decide to continue in the race, whereas I did, unsuccessfully. But I ran because I felt like I could do a better job than a city councilor. I wasn't looking for an easy ride into a seat at the time where there was no incumbent.
Yeah.
And so that ended in October 22nd, 2018. That's my first run, so I remember the election date exactly. Yeah. And then I was looking for someone to share my life with as well, and so I met the complainant in November. We dated for a couple of months. Ultimately, it flamed out. And then through what I thought was a chance meeting, although perhaps maybe it wasn't, I bumped into her again in March. And in April, I was invited to stay over. And as I had previously done before, I won't get into all of the specifics, but essentially in the middle of the night, she had woken up and said her friend needed her. This is winter, okay? It's past midnight, and I was like, okay, weird, but would you like me to go with you? Middle of the night. She's like, no, it's fine. So I'm like, hey, can I sleep here the night and leave in the morning as I previously had? Again, it's winter, it's cold, it's middle of the night. She's like, sure. So she leaves, and I fall asleep. The next thing I know, I'm being woken up by a strange woman, never met before, who says I need to leave. And so, I'm groggy. I'm like, okay, weird, but fine. This must be her friend. I don't know. Yeah. And so I left. And next thing I know, in the morning when I wake up, I have calls from Toronto Police, 2 voicemails saying I've been alleged of sexual assault, right? And they're saying I touched her wrong when we fell asleep cuddling. So we fell asleep touching. One of the questions that any time any sexual assault is alleged is was there a rape kit? What rape kit would you conduct on having touched someone wrong, having fallen asleep touching? So the other inconsistency is the Toronto Police took corroborating witness from what I guess is her friend, the strange woman that I had never seen before, who wasn't even there. Right. And so these inconsistencies obviously aren't articulated in the Toronto Star article, nor did, frankly, I guess the Liberals or the NDP seem to care, because in a court of public opinion, they saw an opportunity in the NDP in particular to just throw out the foundation of our rule of law and our justice system because they thought maybe they could pick up a seat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the context in which this discussion happens, obviously, and the broader social context is one in which frankly, so many women have been victims of sexual violence, have come forward and have not been believed, have had their experiences dismissed, and that
No, and Gordon, you're right.
And so that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have due process and rule of law, but I think you understand the social context, and it responds to legitimate problems. I think some aspects of that story, of your story, had been told before. What is new, I think, this week is your kind of allegation saying that, like, hey, there's a few pieces here that look like more than just two different accounts of events by two different people that look like something else even more nefarious.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I think every allegation should be taken very seriously. But I think we also should ensure that we are not destroying people's reputations, particularly if an allegation is proven to be false and withdrawn, right? I've heard from far too many individuals. Like, in my case, the Crown prosecutor didn't even think it was worthy to take to court. So I didn't even get my day in court. But I've heard from individuals who did get their day in court, who were found innocent, and yet their reputations were still in tatters. And it destroyed their careers. It destroyed their relationships with friends and family, all because of one false allegation. And part of the reason
just jump in there too. Like the innocent until proven guilty issue is important for criminal law, but formally speaking, the court doesn't find people innocent, right? It just says, well, there's not enough evidence to convict in this case, right? So, again, that there's a certain margin
which
there.
Is fair, but I think you and I both know, and a lot of people do too, that lawyers choose their words very intentionally. And the Crown prosecutor didn't say there's no reasonable chance of conviction. She was very specific in recommending to the justice that it was not in the public interest to pursue. How could it not be in the public interest to pursue? In this social context, where for far too long, women's allegations were not being taken seriously, I think any Crown prosecutor would have loved the opportunity to nail someone, a semi-public figure like myself up until that time and in the military to the wall. But instead, not only did she say it, not use the words that it wasn't, reasonable chance of conviction or anything like that. She said it was not in the public interest to pursue. And I think a lot of people can really read in between the lines about what this Crown prosecutor was really saying.
So your tie between that aspect of your experience and the foreign interference issue is to say, there are some characteristics here, that appear, coincidental, almost like a setup, that suggest that there may be, that there may have been a setup involved. That's essentially, and you're suggesting that the setup may have gone back to, to the very beginning of this relationship, that you were identified as someone who had certain convictions that were, and I guess what's interesting to me about that is that, like, if that's true, it suggests that back 4 or 5 years ago, the government of China was in a sophisticated way identifying people who were potential threats to them and running, quite lengthy, sophisticated operations to try to damage your reputation. Like I think what you're alleging isn't just that someone came up with something in the context of an election campaign to target a candidate, but that this was sort of a longer running baked effort. Is that right?
I think it's plausible, right? I think we know that the Chinese Communist Party operates not in years or election cycles, but in decades. They take a long-term view to things. And I don't know if this was something that they identified after my first run for public office, or if they just saw an opportunity to be able to besmirch my name during the federal election.
Had you been vocal on anti-communist causes prior to that?
Well, both in terms of my service with democratically aligned Chinese and Vietnamese community boards.
Okay.
And frankly, you don't have to be a political scientist to know, given that my family was run out of their country by communists that I would not be sympathetic to the Chinese Communist Party. But I don't have a direct line to the Chinese consulate in Toronto, right? I wouldn't just pick up the phone, and nor would they just call me and let me know that they're trying to interfere in my election. But I think if anyone takes an objective step back and looks at the timeline, I think it's plausible.
Okay. Okay. So you're not saying you have proof, but you're saying aspects of the circumstances here are suspicious, and there's it's plausible, especially because of your previous you're someone that was involved with you have the family background we talked about. You were involved with Chinese Canadian, Vietnamese Canadian organizations, and in a way that would have demonstrated aspects of your values. And then this whole issue of a honey trap. Could you explain for people who haven't heard this term before, what is a honey trap? What does that mean?
A honey trap is the use of sex to ultimately be able to find someone in a vulnerable position. Some people might be familiar with it from Hollywood. The Russians, the Soviets used it quite a bit with what they called these particular individual swallows. And so it's something that has continued, and it's something that fits with the Chinese Communist MO. They use various tactics to be able to intimidate and harass people, to silence critics. And in this instance, what could have happened is to try to destroy my name and reputation, so that even if I did get elected, that I would not be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Garnet, I know what happened, and I know it doesn't add up. I think, I think anyone who would kind of zoom out and really look at this would agree that there are some very questionable things that happened. And I would challenge anyone to be like, well, prove to me that it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's going to be a lot of unknowns here, but I think your description of where you stood and the things that made you a target, and kind of some of the steps that led up to these events are interesting.
Garnet, I'll say too, I've been reflecting on all of the lead up to events to September of 2021 and the election day, and during that time till now. And there's a lot more now that I know, being in Ottawa and having spoken to other MPs, and frankly others who have been affected or victims of Chinese targeting, mm-hmm. where I know I'm not the only one for whom honeypot or frankly honey trap or any other tactics might have been used, right? Mm-hmm. So what I know now compared to what I knew when I was first elected really corroborates a lot of what's been reported.
Could you share some of those other stories you've heard? Obviously anonymizing personal details, but what are some of the other things you know of that have happened to MPs, to other public officials along these lines?
Unfortunately, probably the most topical example right now is Michael Chong.
Yeah.
Right? And what's happened to him is horrific. And hopefully this is the tipping point in helping Canadians to understand how important it is that we take that this government acts. And I know we'll discuss kind of the different things that they could easily be doing right now, but aren't. I know your former Conservative colleague, Kenny Chu, has alleged, in terms of all of the disinformation that happened, that turned individuals in his riding, who otherwise were huge supporters of his, to suddenly, never mind not engage or become apathetic, but outright reject and decline him, to become angry at him for some made up charges that he hated Chinese people, or something to the effect of them wanting Chinese people to be interned, like our country had tragically did with Japanese Canadians during World War II. These are all different tactics that have now been part of the reporting that's gone on. But the thing that I think people don't fully appreciate is that foreign interference isn't necessarily just about getting rid of their critics and detractors. It's also about elevating individuals who would advance their agenda, right? And we've read a lot of that reporting as well too, around individuals who might have potentially been winning affiliates, and those are just as concerning when it comes to foreign interference, right? Because we all want to believe that the individuals who are setting government policy, who gets funded, which trade agreements get signed, any number of things on behalf of our country are doing it in the best interest of Canada. And when that comes into question, it becomes a significant concern. And where the government can easily act to start to disperse some of those things and start to act to combat foreign interference, they dither, they delay, they obfuscate, and it just doesn't make any sense. I don't understand why.
Yeah. So I want to get to the specific policy proposals around how to respond to this problem. But first, I want to ask you about the current experience of the Chinese Canadian diaspora. It seems that there's kind of a squeeze from both sides, where on the one hand you have increasing pressure on the diaspora from foreign interference, that is, threats to people, threats to their families, and this is a very negative reality in this country. I've been vocal on I've been very vocal on the CCP, but I'm less of a target because I'm I don't have family in China or Hong Kong, and but I think part of that pressure as well is this ideology of ethnic nationalism that's emerging within the CCP that involves this idea that somehow Chinese Canadians owe something to the Communist Party, and that leads to a greater level of anger and pressure when people like you and Michael Chong and Jenny Kwan and others are vocally speaking out against that oppression. So I think there's this pressure on the diaspora community from the Chinese Communist Party that's maybe unique and different from what other Canadians may experience. But then on the other side, you have growing concern about anti-Chinese and more broadly anti-Asian racism, where people that are concerned about the Beijing Communist Party or just angry, hateful people are now targeting Chinese Canadians. So you kind of have this negativity coming from both ends, and it must be a challenging time. You've got a lot of Chinese Canadian constituents. So what are how do you perceive the nature of this pressure, and what are you hearing from your constituents about it?
I mean, I've heard from constituents who have family still in China and Hong Kong, and they self-censor. There's an inherent distrust because of their own lived experience having left that, where even here in Canada, because they've raised their concerns and it seems to have fallen on deaf ears, where they start to distrust even the government here. People start to isolate themselves. They disconnect from the community, and that's immensely concerning, even from, frankly, just a basic human psychosocial perspective, right? But putting that aside, then there are, I can tell you, even in my own example, we're fortunate that I don't have any family in China to worry about. But even my father, for example, had thought about, hey, maybe going back and visiting some of his friends in Vietnam or others in China. He doesn't even want to fly through Hong Kong, right? So there's that. But I think one of the broader issues is this suspicion and cloud of a question of loyalty to any Chinese person, and frankly, anyone who might look like they're a Chinese person. And so until the best way, I think, really to tackle, and not to get ahead of myself in terms of, but I do want to throw out one policy prescription, is foreign operatives operate they hide in the shadows. And so one of the best ways, to use, the prime minister's term, is to return to sunny ways, to shine light into the shadows where they hide. And one of the best ways to do that is transparency. And an effective way that our friends in the US and Australia have is a foreign agent registry, right? That's an easy way to almost very quickly identify individuals who are working, and it could be for legitimate business reasons, which is fantastic. It could be cultural reasons. That's fine too. But it's about adding transparency where there isn't any right now.
Yeah, so I think the Foreign Agents Registry, I think it's an important tool. It has been criticized from some quarters, including by some Liberal MPs, who say that this is going to contribute to racism. It's going to contribute to suspicion. But I guess your point is that it actually does the opposite, because when you're saying that people that are working on behalf of foreign interests have to register, then they have to identify themselves, and then it potentially reduces the suspicion around
because you know who's working on advancing various foreign interests, right? And like I said, it could be for very legitimate reasons. And frankly, to those critics who are making up this magical accusation of racism, there seems to be a weird alignment in terms of throwing out this racist card, because that's the exact same thing that the Chinese Communist Party is saying, that this is somehow racist. And as well, they seem to ignore all of the Chinese Canadians who have come out very strongly in support of and have been demanding for years now a foreign agent registry. So it's just so convenient that this racism card that's played is suspiciously in alignment with the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I think it was one of the first podcast episodes I did, a second episode maybe, where we talked precisely about this issue of, is the Chinese Communist Party sort of using using the fear of anti-Asian racism to try to cover up their own activities. And I think it's so important for us to be fiercely critical of the problem of anti-Asian racism, and to also recognize that disagreeing with a foreign government is not racism, that criticizing a foreign government is not racism. And I think even beyond that, I think all of us have a lot to learn from Chinese philosophy, Chinese civilizations. I'm a reader of Confucius. The more I've kind of studied the last couple of years, I've come to develop a really intense interest in and appreciation for Chinese culture and history. And for me, there's a very sort of sharp break between what China is and opposing communism, which is communism is in fact an import from Europe, right? It's not a product of Chinese culture. Marx was not Chinese, right? So, but I think your point about ignoring the voice of Chinese Canadians, how the Communist Party ignores the voice of Chinese people who disagree with it is so important, because I think the Chinese Communist Party is very racist in its mentality here, actually, because it's saying that if you have a certain ethnic background, you should have a certain opinion. Whereas in Canada, we believe that people are individuals. They think about issues, they come to their own conclusions. There are as many different perspectives as there are people, and people who have different perspectives can come from all different backgrounds.
Absolutely. And I think this goes back to kind of what you're saying in terms of this concept they have of ethnic nationalism, right? Where it goes beyond borders. If you're Chinese, doesn't matter where you are, you are part of our collective, and you must advance our agenda. That's wrong. I'm proud to be a Canadian of Chinese heritage, but there's a reason why my parents risked life and limb and survived 2 years in refugee camp to come here. It's so that we could have our individual freedoms. And frankly, and we were discussing this before we started, where one of the largest noticeable groups that are now trying to illegally immigrate into the US via the Mexican border are Chinese citizens who are trying to escape the regime, who are making their way in through there. And so I think this really is vital that we actually step up to protect Canadians of Chinese heritage, because and I want to say to those who are believe it's racist, it is not. It is, in fact, the fact that you're trying to exploit this to stop it from happening is the racist act.
So let's delve in the last 10 minutes or so into some of the nitty gritty of the policy. You've mentioned one policy the government could implement on combating foreign interference, and that is to have a foreign agents registry. Aside from the kind of I think in some ways less serious critiques, there might be practical critiques of something like that. How is it going to work? Is it logistically feasible? How many people would have to register? And then also criminals aren't going to register their guns. Point. You could maybe make a similar point here. Are foreign spies going to register their activity? Probably not. So how do you respond to those kinds of criticisms?
Yeah, no, that's fair. But what it does is it provides authorities with a mechanism with which to be able to do something. It's a tool, right? So if there are individuals who are not reporting their activities, what are the penalties that are set up? Will we fine them a certain amount? Could there be jail time? Those are all things to be debated. But the government needs to bring it to the House so that we can start acting on it now. Why they're tying it up in this process of exploration makes no sense to me, because it's clear it's been demanded by Canadians of many different ethnic communities, but especially Chinese Canadians. And so they should listen to the people and actually, start that process now to figure it out. We can adapt the model, whether it's in the US or Australia, for a Canadian context, but let's start the process now. Why do they continue to delay?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That it's a tool. It's not the be all end all. I think there will be people involved in very clandestine activities who will still do those activities and not register, and they will need to be punished in other ways. But it creates a level of transparency, which means that if someone requests a meeting with me who's part of an organization, we can, if they're speaking on behalf of a foreign government, we can find that out. And if they are an established organization that is speaking on behalf of a foreign government or advancing that government's interests but is not registered, then there's an added tool for the legal system to hold them accountable for that, because they're required to register and they're not, rather than having these organizations that are advancing foreign interests not identifying the fact that they're doing so, and simply trying to present themselves as reflective of some set of interests and ideas in Canada. So yeah, I think it's a positive step.
Yeah, the other side of it too is for us as MPs, we get invited to so many events, and it's sad that the discourse right now is these gotcha moments where it's oh, you met with this person who is unsavory or has said this controversial thing, and so this is yet another tool for us when we're invited to an event to be able to assess hey, is this a legitimate organization, or are they a front for the United Work Front Department that works on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, right? This is a tool that we need, and it's my hope that the government stops delaying and acts soon.
Yeah. The Foreign Influence Registry was a key issue used to target Kenny Chiu in the last election. Kenny Chiu, Conservative MP, Chinese Canadian, put forward a private member's bill to create a foreign influence registry, and there was a lot of, I think, misinformation about that led to that contributed at least to his defeat.
And it's
So
very
it would
plausible,
be
right?
quite a reversal for the government of Canada to, after benefiting from that foreign interference to such an extent, to turn around and implement that policy.
Well, and frankly, that was one of my questions when they said that they're going to, create a special rapporteur. One of my questions to them was like, well, the primary beneficiary has been the Liberal Party of Canada. Will Mr. Johnston have the ability to be able to investigate the Liberal Party of Canada as part of this process?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a critical question. Like, what are the? I mean, political parties in general sort of function as private clubs, right? And this is another kind of one of the contributing factors here that that they make their own rules. They determine who the candidates are, and of course, people are free to vote for whoever they want between the parties. But in practice, most people vote along partisan lines and vote based on party labels for candidates that they've been given. Um, so we have the issue of a foreign influence registry. What other policy proposals could be put forward that would address this issue?
Well, maybe not a policy per se, but with particularly within the context of Michael Chong, there is an existing Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations from 1961, and clearly it already has in Article 9 the ability for the government to be able to act, irrespective of the fact that that diplomat in the Toronto consulate is like the literal poster child for persona non grata.
Mm-hmm.
Why does the government not expel a member of the diplomatic staff of the mission where, as I understand too, Canada has a disproportionate number of Chinese diplomats more than our G7 counterparts?
Mm-hmm. So the expulsion of diplomats, and I think that's an important point. Is foreign interference, it takes many forms. It doesn't always involve diplomats. We have problems with foreign interference from the government of Iran, even though we don't we closed the embassy during the Harper years. But diplomats can and I think it realistically do play a role as enablers or direct actors in foreign interference as well. And the least we can do is expel diplomats that are involved in this. One of our critiques has been the government has not expelled a single diplomat
Sure.
in relation to foreign interference. Not just failing to expel anyone from the government of China, but also government of Russia and other actors. There has not been a single expulsion of a diplomat for those reasons since they took office. So, I mean, what do you read into that? I mean, why this should have seemed like a very easy thing to do, and it's not actually. It doesn't require legislation or regulation. It's just a matter of them doing it. Why do you think they haven't done it?
I have no idea. I think, I've tried to really, take a step back and try to come up with a rational explanation on why it is that this government seems to be so hesitant to do anything as it relates to China.
Mm-hmm.
As all of this information comes out in terms of, some members of their caucus or party being entangled in there, I just can start to ask myself, like, just how entangled are they? Is that why they're so hesitant to call an independent public inquiry? Is that why they're so hesitant to expel a diplomat? Like, why do they continue to turn a blind eye to this blatant interference?
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are good questions. But in answering them, on why they haven't taken more action, you're maybe in a better position than I am because although you didn't have a partisan background, you weren't one of these people that was active in the Liberal Party from a young age. You have some window into the party culture that maybe I don't as a conservative. I mean, I try to watch what other parties are doing, but there's something about being inside the zone of trust that at least for a period of time that it gives you an understanding. I mean, is there anything from the conversations you've had with people at the time you were a liberal, like that gives you some window into the thinking that might be going on here that leads to to not moving forward on a registry, not expelling diplomats. You know what? I spoke in the House this week. I said, or last week, and I said, you know, the lack of response, it's either naivety, weakness, or it's being compromised. It's one of those three, or a combination of the three. What any light you can shed on what might be going on?
I mean, in terms of my conversations with different senior Liberals and including kind of former Liberal MPs as well too, we ask frankly all of the same questions, and we have come to kind of your same conclusion, because there is no other rational explanation for their inaction and why they continue to turn a blind eye to this.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a wide-ranging conversation, and I appreciate your willingness to go over some ground that obviously is uncomfortable and painful, but I think it's obviously part of the conversation we're having now as a country, and so I'll give the last word back to you to share any final thoughts on your experience, on how we go forward as a country, united, sovereign, and with our parliamentary institutions working well, and with all Canadians, especially those from diaspora communities, enjoying the freedoms that they rightfully deserve.
Well, Garnet, I appreciate the opportunity to come on. You know, every time that I've risen in the House to provide constructive criticism or ask questions of this government, including on foreign interference, some Liberal MPs will turn around and yell that I'm a Conservative. So I guess it makes sense that I'm on a podcast right now with a Conservative speaking about these really important issues. You know, what happened to me a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now, didn't make sense until all this stuff came out and people were coming to me with different concerns and what they knew. And part of the reason why I've spoken out is not only just to clear my name, which I believe is important, but that I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else. I don't want the weaponization of an allegation to become another tool in the arsenal of foreign operatives. And I wanted to demonstrate the real tangible consequence of the continued inaction. So from individuals like Kenny Chu on the West Coast, coming across to Michael Chong and to myself, these are just three examples. How many other people have been intimidated into silence, who have been harassed and are so scared and have had to change the trajectories of their careers or their lives? Who knows what else have happened to other people? And I think it's incumbent on the people who are elected to represent the people of this country that we step up, we do something, we stop it. Because for a long time, Canada was a beacon for hope and for democracy. And right now it's under attack, and we have a duty to protect it.
Powerful conclusion. Thank you, Kevin Vuong, for joining us for a great conversation. Folks, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, 5-star review where you get your podcast. Subscribe. We try to come up with these episodes every 2 weeks, and we try to have conversations that are, of course, longer form, go more in depth into issues of the day, and bring on people with a range of perspectives. I have had Conservative MPs on here also, but also as well, but independent, liberal, NDP. We've had people from a broad range of different perspectives, authors, experts, for kind of longer form, more nonpartisan conversation of the issues of the day. I think Kevin has been a great guest in terms of providing us with some of that good perspective. And I hope if you've enjoyed this episode, you'll be back again for another episode of Resuming Debate in 2 weeks.
Thank you.